Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, a prize-fighting pugilist, trapped in a cell in solitude, finding that because they have no one else to fight with, they must instead fight themselves. Here today to talk to you about Mars in retrograde. Now, out of all of the planets that go retrograde, I find Mars's retrograde periods the most difficult. With the other planets, we have established rhythms of retrograde motion and direct motion. For instance, in the planets Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Chiron, they spend about half the year in retrograde phase anyway, so it's part of an established seasonal rhythm, and therefore when there is direct motion or retrograde motion, the effects are usually much more subtle, less dramatic, and more short-lived. We have Mercury retrogrades several times a year. Venus retrogrades occur about every 18 months. But Mars retrogrades occur every 2 years, and therefore the shock and disruption that they bring is much greater. I think one of the reasons why Mars retrogrades can be so difficult is because Mars is the planet of action, of force, of vitality, of passion, of having this driving engine that carries us into the future and closer towards our goals and the things that we desire. But the very nature of a retrograde is to gradually contain a planet, to conceal it, to restrict it, to inhibit it, to enforce it, to introvert and analyze its energies before it is prepared to begin a new cycle. And I think one of the things I haven't heard many astrologers emphasize when talking about the retrograde cycles of a planet is that when a planet is going retrograde, it is essentially ending a cycle. It is going through a period of death and transformation, which when it then stations direct, initiates a new cycle, a period of new life, a period of new beginnings. And with Mars, this is especially significant because it is the ending of a 2-year cycle and the initiation of another 2-year cycle. Now, because of this, I very often feel that there is a distinctly 12th house flavour to Mars retrograde periods, as it represents this transitional time, this state of being incomplete, uncertain, and in between, of being in a purgatory of action and motion, where we have to surrender our old approaches and ways of doing things and instead find a new area in which we can find a sense of direction, a sense of purpose, a sense of momentum, energy, passion, drive, strength, independence, and authority. And this is difficult because if we have an old area in which we experienced power, in which we experienced drive, in which we felt that strong sense that we could make things succeed and happen, we are usually reluctant to let go of that until fate intervenes and indicates that it is a time where we have to switch lanes, where we have to find a new direction instead of just falling upon the comforting habits and routines of where we were previously energized. And the reason I am making this video on Mars retrograde well in advance, given that Mars doesn't actually station retrograde until December 7th, 2024, is because I feel this is a retrograde that casts a very long shadow, that the pre-retrograde period can often be felt weeks, if not months in advance. If we think about Mars having this 2-year cycle, naturally it's a bit like a greyhound being let out of the racecourse. When it first comes throttling out of the gates, it's going to feel very vivacious, very full of energy, very focused, and full of hope and aspiration for what it can achieve. But the further it goes on along that course, and reaches its points of completion, gradually over time that energy is begin to stagger. It's going to begin to deplete, it's going to begin to feel burnt out, and especially if it's managed to achieve what it has set out to achieve, it may begin to feel more introspective as it wonders, okay, well, what next? Especially if it's felt dissatisfied or disillusioned or underwhelmed by any achievements that it has made over that course and that cycle, it might begin to question itself and say, well, actually, are the things that I was doing, are the things that I was seeking, are the things that once filled me with so much fire really the right course for me anymore? So I think as Mars begins this gradual process of kind of returning home in preparation for its next cycle before it stations retrograde, there can have been a few months leading up to that where we might begin to feel a bit more directionless, a bit lacking in clarity about our future or about what really motivates us or gives us a purpose to carry on living, and have that sense that our life is moving in a meaningful and propulsive direction. Sometimes that can manifest very definitely as a period of depression where we no longer feel we have that go-get-em attitude. We no longer feel like we can motivate ourselves. Or even if we are still very active, there might be that sense that we're just going through the motions, that we are sleepwalking through life, that we are just doing the things that we have habituated ourselves to do, but without there being any real heartfelt, passionate content or fire infused into what we do. Sometimes it can seem that it is more a product of external qualities. It might naturally feel that in the period leading up to the next cycle, that our external life is slowing down, that less things are happening, that less work is coming our way, or that in general there is less to occupy us, which instead forces us to have to rest, to regroup our energies, and to really think much more conscientiously about where we are intending to direct ourselves. But while for some, those final few months before the next cycle begins might be typified by feelings of stagnation, desuetude, disillusionment, lack of momentum, and loss of clarity about the future, for some people it can be more disruptive and come in the form of a crisis. They might be very happy with how things have been going or the direction they were moving and have felt very confident and sure about that, when suddenly a crisis can come along which can force them to redirect their energies whether they really want to. So for instance, someone could have a health crisis leading up to this and realize that if they want to get better, if they want to survive, if they don't want to be overcome with sickness and sorrow, then they're going to have to radically alter their lifestyle. If someone loses their job in the build up to this period, they might feel quite happy or ready to let that job go or not, but still have that awareness that there is now a vacuum to be filled, that they need to find a new job, that they need to find a new way of making money, but might not necessarily have any insight as to what that could be. Someone might get an eviction notice in the house or flat or property that they're inhabiting and realize that they need to move somewhere else, but again, without that clear sense of what the destination can be. So sometimes that period of preparing for the new cycle comes in the form of a crisis which poses a question of, I have a problem here that needs resolving. How the fuck am I going to resolve it? The crises that are initiated in the pre-retrograde phase can often be of a particularly frustrating, gnawing and tense nature in which we feel left on tenterhooks with a specific problem. It may be that we have a crisis that needs our critical attention, where we urgently feel that need to take action and try and resolve whatever problem or conundrum we've been presented with as quickly as possible. And yet, for one reason or another, we find that circumstances do not support us in this, that there are various obstacles, delays, considerations, or difficulties that prevent us from taking action, as though we are being directly obstructed from finding an easy fix or solution to the problem at hand. And because of that energy that wants to be put out externally, that wants to take action, that wants to take flight, that wants to fight for its survival in a particular area, instead finds itself thwarted and instead is more likely to turn in on itself and be suppressed and introjected and introverted, which is very difficult because fire wants to flame outward. And when you suddenly find that all of your fire is forced within yourself and that there's nothing you can really do with it for a temporary amount of period, we are more likely to feel irritable, we are more likely to feel at war with ourselves, to feel a sense of rage, fury, and impotence at a world that isn't supporting our needs, wishes, and desires, and therefore we can also be more inclined to act restlessly, to act erratically, or to lash out and project that anger on a world that we don't feel is supporting us, which can cause us in the build-up to a retrograde to make some headstrong, unruly, or rather impetuous decisions. It's almost like because we don't feel we can properly exert and extrovert our energies in the area we want to, we instead lash it out on the ones that are available to us. And I have found that breakups in relationships do seem to occur more commonly in the weeks and sometimes the 2 months prior to a Mars retrograde. It can almost be like feeling that impulsive desire to want to get ahead, to move forward, to break free from anything that we feel is inhibiting us or slowing us down in any way. Becomes something we are more likely to project onto our partners, to feel like this person is holding me back, that if I didn't have to consider this other person and all of their needs and all of the other things that demand my time and energy, maybe I would have the freedom to make more breakthroughs in these other areas. Compared to Venus, Mars likes simplicity. It likes streamlined action. And if it feels it can push all of its powers in one area by cutting away anything that is annoying it or nagging it or inhibiting it in any way or placing other demands on it, then it can make those decisions to end certain partnerships quite abruptly as a means of actually projecting the real problem onto someone else. That's not always the case. Sometimes a relationship genuinely is fragile and ready to end prior to a retrograde, but being aware that we can be more inclined to act impulsively or project our anger onto issues that aren't directly connected with it is something it would be useful to bear in mind in the build-up to this period, so that we are less inclined to make drastic decisions that we haven't properly thought through. And I think this is one of the very tenets of what we have to learn in Mars retrograde periods, that instead of just acting impulsively and intuitively and in the spirit of the moment, we instead have to spend a lot more time deliberating and considering and properly contemplating what we are going to do next and how we are going to do it. And sometimes the world will not always support us in this. Again, if there's that sense of urgency, there's that sense of something needing to be imminently resolved, if other people see that we're going through that condition and apparently not acting on it when actually we are, but all of the action is taking place internally, we might then experience more conflict from the outer world saying, well, you've got this problem, why aren't you doing this, that, or the other about it? And them not fully understanding that there are some things that we can only resolve through waiting for conditions to change. It's a bit like when people are doing roadworks on a road and there's a diversion. You can't just go ploughing into those roadworks. You can't use that road again until it's properly been fixed. And sometimes that need to have to take a diversion, to have to find an alternative route, can be the thing that motivates us towards discovering a new beginning or a new direction for ourselves, which we wouldn't have explored had the retrograde not forced us into a situation in which that adjustment and reorientation became something that was necessary to our survival. Now, for those of you who wish to navigate the difficulties, tensions, frustrations, but ultimate resolutions and breakthroughs of the Mars retrograde period, again, as conscientiously as possible, we will best manage this if we understand how Mars retrograde is interacting with our natal charts. Because while everyone on the whole fucking planet will be experiencing Mars retrograde, going through the same signs and also in aspect to the same transiting planets, how it personalizes itself into a situation specific to you is all based on how Mars is aspecting your natal chart. And if you look specifically at the house or houses that Mars is going retrograde in, it can tell you the area in which a crisis is likely to occur, or the area in which you find you have to discover your power, strength, authority, and independence. And the degree to which we find this difficult or not too trying will depend upon our relationship to that house. I feel like if Mars goes retrograde in a house that we know very well, or have more of a fluid or flexible attitude towards, we might be quite grateful for the Mars retrograde, because it's bringing our attention and focus and power and energy back to an area of our lives where we might naturally already feel empowered, where we have lots of experience, where we have some sense of what we're doing. We can be ready and willing to kind of re-energize and revitalize our relationship with that aspect of our lives. But I think if Mars is going through a house in which we don't have much experience, perhaps we don't have any placements there, or we do, but we haven't yet learned how to express them or externalize them, when Mars comes along, it might feel like he's teaching us how to fight and be a mighty warrior, in an area where we actually feel quite pathetic, where we feel helpless, where we don't feel strong, we don't feel experienced, where we feel immature and wet behind the ears. Because we don't feel like we know what we're doing there, we lack confidence to take initiative in that area. But Mars is the planet of initiative. He is the planet of new beginnings. He is considered to be the natural ruler of the first house, which is when the chart begins, when the cycle begins, when a new everything begins. So where Mars is retrograding can also indicate an area where we need to experience a new empowerment in some way. But we can often only fully access that empowerment if we are willing to fully face the insecurities and fears and hang-ups from the past that may have inhibited us from finding our passion in that area previously. But in noting the house in which Mars will be going retrograde, I think it's also very useful to pay attention to the house that Mars is opposite in your natal chart as well, because Mars is naturally a planet of struggles and oppositions. If we're experiencing difficulties in the area, in the house where Mars is retrograding, usually those will have a knock-on and shadow effect in the house that Mars is opposite. So if it's going through the 4th, that will be reflected in issues in the 10th. If it's going through the 2nd, that will be reflected in issues through the 8th, and so on and so forth. The most dramatic Mars retrogrades personally experienced will be those going through the angular houses, because they are the houses of manifestation and externalization. So that's the 1st, 4th, and 7th and 10th houses. So hold on for a bumpy ride if Mars is going retrograde through any of those. Also, if Mars is going retrograde, strongly aspecting planets in your natal chart, perhaps it's directly conjunct a planet, directly opposite, or in a tight square or trine, that can also indicate other areas where there will be knock-on effects. So I'm going to move away from the realm of abstraction now and give you some real-life examples of Mars retrogrades of mine, so they can help bring to life how the issues of Mars retrograde can be expressed through the lens of the natal chart that it is transiting through. So the last Mars retrograde we had was at the end of October 2022, don't I remember it well? And Mars was in Gemini going retrograde through my 4th house. Now the 4th house is connected with our home life, with domesticity, with literal physical homes, but also with our inner life, our emotional life, and our dependency needs, our needs to rely upon other people for love, nurturance, and caretaking. And as I said, the issues related to Mars retrograde often express themselves several months or weeks prior to the retrograde itself. And in the several months leading up to this, I had been given an eviction notice on the place that I was living. And this was particularly frustrating as at the time I was on the waiting list to start receiving hormone therapy. And as I was going private, it was also something I was going to have to pay for as well. And knowing that I was going to be going through this big inner hormonal change, hence fourth house, you're in a world going through a state of transformation, knowing that that was going to be taking place. What I wanted more than anything is what every fourth house person wants. They want a safe home, they want a safe environment where they feel secure, where they feel the ground below them is safe, and where they feel that there are people and things around them which nurture them, take care of them, and make them feel like they are supported. That is what I wanted more than anything. Instead, because Mars is always going to force us to be independent in an area rather than dependent, I found that all of those things started falling apart. I was given an eviction notice on the place that I was living, where I was very happy and had no desire to move from, and had 6 months to find a new place without having any idea of where I needed to go. At the same time, having a knock-on effect with my 10th house, I also found that suddenly, whereas I had lots of work previously, a lot of my jobs, due to factors of illness, rapidly came to an end. So moving wouldn't have been such a big issue if I knew I had lots of work and plenty of cash flow. Instead, all of that came to an end, and I was stuck with the problem of knowing I had a limited amount of time to find somewhere new to move to without having a sense of having a safety net, without also having enough work to be able to pay for a place that was probably going to be more expensive than the one I was in now. So I was already left with this dilemma and feeling the terror of thinking on top of that, I also needed to make sure I had enough money coming in and a new home in the future so that I would have a safe place to incubate the hormonal changes I was going to go through when I would start estrogen in a few months' time. So it felt like everything I didn't want to happen was happening, that all of the safety and security that I was craving was under a threat in the build-up to Mars retrograde. What amplified this even further is that while I was going through these difficulties, what I wanted more than anything, being in that needy, vulnerable fourth house place, was someone to take care of me. And I was in a relationship at the time, and I was really hoping that this would be a moment where my partner would step in and say, don't worry, I'll take care of you. You can come and live with me until you find a new job and get yourself back on your feet. I'll be there for you, blah, blah, blah. That's what I hoped for. Instead, my partner was freaked out that I didn't immediately take action and immediately find a new place to rent, or didn't immediately find new work, and made me feel bad about being stressed out and panicked about the situation I was in, which only compounded the panic and anxiety that I felt. And so at the moment when I most wanted support, instead I felt like I was experiencing attack. And obviously this is another expression of Mars retrograde, where we tend to feel that our environment and the people who populate that environment, instead of feeling supportive of us, can either be in competition with us, can be in opposition with us, can be in conflict with us, or can be trying to motivate us, but doing it in ways that tend to undermine us rather than support us. But the knock-on effect of receiving opposition, where I was hoping for nourishment and support, had the impact that Mars wanted, that it was encouraging me to be more independent. And when I realised that I couldn't be a fourth house baby and expect other people to take care of me and do my hard work for me, it meant I really had to fall back on my own resources and discover my own powers of looking after myself and taking the initiative instead of relying upon other people. I didn't want to. I wanted to kick and scream like a baby and have a big tantrum, but ultimately all of the circumstances conspired and combined together to force myself to have to try and find a new direction. But the problem was, as I said earlier, is that even once we start taking the initiative in that pre-retrograde period and during the retrograde phase itself, is that very often things don't seem to take off or take root in the way that we hope they would. We find ourselves stuck in this holding pattern where we are forced to wait for circumstances to change, where we have to contain our energies rather than extroverting it. So even though in the build-up to that I started to become more independent and I did seek new work, the new work wasn't really taking off. It wasn't bringing as much money as I needed to resolve this situation. And there were a few moments where it looked like actually maybe someone else was going to buy the property I was in and that perhaps I would be able to stay, and then that would end up falling through as well. And then finally, the relationship that I was in ended, and that was partly my fault because, again, I talked about that tendency to project the rage that we feel onto other people during retrogrades and the build up to it, because it forces us to be more independent. If we feel that other people haven't supported us, if we feel that people have let us down during the times when we most need them, have compelled us to be independent when we really don't want to, we are more likely to project our rage onto those other people who we feel have rejected us or let us down. And in general, retrogrades bring up past issues. So if there is any buried anger, hostility, or feelings of resentment and bitterness that we have kind of suppressed during the direct motion phase of the cycle, we may find that during the retrograde it becomes harder and harder to contain and to moderate and lie about those feelings. They are more likely to come to the surface and demand an expression so that we can see whether there is an opportunity to resolve those anger issues, or whether they have to ultimately result in a period of alienation and separation. Now, at the same time, I was also stuck because I was still looking for a new place to move to, and I was every day looking for places that rooms to rent and things like that were within my budget, and either nothing was coming up or I would just get the same rooms over and over again, but they were ones that weren't right for me, which weren't within my budget, or where I wasn't getting responses from the people who had posted the ads to begin with. And at the same time, I was getting this pressure from my mother, who was trying to be supportive, but was actually making things more difficult, in that she was constantly sending me all these pictures of houses from Rightmove or places to rent, but which were about 3 or 4 times out of my budget, which I couldn't have afforded. And had I rushed in and immediately grabbed one of those places like my mother wanted me to do, I would have rapidly gone into debt, because I would not have been able to afford the upkeep necessary, or I would have been having to work every hour on the day just to maintain one of these places. So it wasn't viable, and it meant more of that frustration of needing a solution than just finding that one wasn't emerging. But because all of these areas where I was trying things were frustrated, it compelled me to be more creative, and I had to start thinking about the outside of the box and consider trying different things. And you often find there is this recalibration period during the retrograde phase where, because our habitual approaches don't work, we start thinking, okay, well, what other outlets, what other avenues of my energy are there? What can I do differently that I haven't tried before, or maybe have wanted to try before, or have needed to, but have resisted due to any insecurities we might have in that area? And one thing that I actually began during that retrograde phase was this YouTube astrology channel that someone had showed me during this time when I was desperately looking for new jobs and new ways of making money. An audition to a play that was going to be put on that required an all-trans cast. I thought, great, well, I've got acting experience. I'm trans, of course they're going to hire me because I'm amazing. And if I got that job, I'd be raking in all this money and all of my problems would be solved. And to do that, I had to make an audition tape. And ultimately, I didn't get through, which was, again, very upsetting and frustrating at the time, just when it felt like I'd reached breakthrough. But seeing myself on camera had been very empowering. And even though I'd been studying astrology for a long time, I had felt a lot of doubt and uncertainty and insecurity about my ability in that area. It was one of those things I kept putting myself out there doing, because I'm a perfectionist, and I always felt like I should know more, that I should be able to do better, and that I wasn't ready. And I started making YouTube videos for my astrology channel at that time. So that was a case where a critical situation had forced me to do something creative, which, when times were normal and comfortable and easygoing, I might have lacked the incentive to do. So even though the difficulties and the tight spots and cul-de-sacs that these retrograde periods force us into can be very frustrating, if we understand that the point of that is to challenge us to start a new direction, then we can be more receptive to taking the initiative and thinking outside the box, rather than just clinging to old ways, which fate is likely to wrestle from. Now, the next important part of this period after the station retrograde is when Mars goes into opposition with the Sun. This usually occurs, I think, roughly about a month after the station retrograde. And if the initial month following the station retrograde is often a time of frustration, of introverted anger, of feeling stuck and helpless and powerless, and not having a satisfying outlet for the energies or the action that we feel we have to take in an area, then the opposition with the Sun often represents a period of breakthrough, where finally that energy finds an outlet, where it begins to be externalized. And in this situation I was just talking about, where Mars was retrograding through the 4th house and in opposition to my 10th house moon, it was at this point during the opposition that finally, out of the blue, some new work came my way, completely unexpectedly, that gave me enough money to feel confident that even if I did have to leave the property where I was then, I would have the money and resources to be able to start afresh and buy somewhere new, and also pay for my all-important hormone therapy coming. So even if I still had some issues unresolved that I didn't know where I was going to go, I had at least been given an outlet for my energies. I finally had something to do, and I finally felt like I was doing something concrete and external that was preparing me for making a new beginning, even if it had arisen as part of a crisis and an emergency situation. And I found this has happened several times during Mars retrograde cycles, that during the Mars-Sun opposition, suddenly things turn and it feels like things are beginning to prepare to move again. In the previous Mars retrograde cycle in 2020, when Mars was retrograde in Aries, going from my 2nd house, it was also very strongly connected to financial issues. And the same thing happened during the Sun-Mars opposition, that I had been struggling to make money and find a direction for myself, or didn't really know what I was doing with myself, and a new job landed in my lap, and it finally meant I could start doing things again and make money. And even though it didn't resolve many of the other issues that were going on at the time, it at least gave me somewhere to start. And that's what happens during the opposition. It's not always an easy time. It can also be a time of dramatic explosions and outbursts, where if we have had lingering conflict or resentment or anger or difficulties with someone, they can sometimes explode and come to the surface during the opposition. And while that might be unpleasant, it can also mean that something that's been suppressed has finally been released. And it's only once it's been released and it has been aired and externalized in some way that dynamic of working towards a resolution, if there is one, can begin to be posed. Now, the next most important part of the cycle is when Mars stations direct and begins moving forwards again instead of backwards. And it's very important to note the precise degree at which Mars stations direct, and to look at all the aspects that makes to other planets in your natal chart, as that house placement and degree placement and cluster of aspects that Mars makes at that time, I have found can almost be read as a birth chart for what is going to be your main emphasis of action and activity and conflict and sexuality and passion and fire for the next 2-year Mars cycle. It is the seed moment of the cycle and therefore should be read as a birth moment. So if you can look at where your Mars is and what it is doing in relation to your other natal planets, it can give you an idea of the events and experiences that are going to take place for you over the next 2 years and how best to direct your energies. So again, to carry on the example of that previous Mars retrograde period, Mars stationed direct at 8 degrees Gemini, which was conjunct my 4th house cusp, however on the 3rd house side. And this ended up being very thematic of the 2 years that were to follow, as the 3rd house is connected to our voices, to our minds, to verbal and intellectual expression, to communication, to teaching and language. That was the period where I started to do a lot more astrology and was very productive in this YouTube channel. I made, I think, about 110 videos in the space of a single year. I was feeling very driven intellectually. I really felt like I'd found my voice, that I was empowered verbally and in various lexicological gymnastics to really feel confident presenting my astrological persona through my ability to communicate, and was constantly reading and researching and just feeling driven to use my mental powers as much as possible. But the 3rd house is also a house of constant motion and activity. It's quite a frenetic, frazzled house, and often when we have transits or progressions through the 3rd, indicates a period where we have to do a lot and juggle many different balls all at once to make things work. It can be quite high functioning but high stress. And I was working constantly through that period. I was juggling many jobs. I was a carer by night. I was doing dog walking and dog sitting by day, and then juggling that with my astrology. So I had many different strands and balls to juggle all at once. It was very rare that I wasn't in motion or transit, and especially because I was doing dog sitting, it very often meant that I was continually moving from one house to another, where I was looking after various dogs or doing overnight stays looking after elderly people. So it was kind of simultaneously combining the constant motion of the 3rd house with the domestic, internal, introverted nature of the 4th house. And I was also having to learn to express more power in 4th house energies, that because I was going through hormonal changes and had begun to take estrogen, I was having to learn how to take better emotional care of myself, to learn to nurture myself in ways that I had perhaps previously expected other people to do, to learn to take care of my domestic environment and to create an environment that gave me a sense of warmth, nourishment and security. But domestic insecurity ended up remaining a constant theme throughout that time, because even when I did find a new place to live, when after Mars had stationed direct and was in its was coming into trine with the Sun, which is often when things finally release and move forwards, and was when I started hormone therapy. I got told by the landlady I was moving in with that, yeah, you can move in, but at some point I'm going to have to sell this place and you're going to have to go elsewhere. So it remained that sense of knowing that the ground was never fully solid beneath my feet during that period, and that I was going to have to develop that kind of quick thinking, quick acting, 3rd house energies to respond to the rapid way in which life was moving during that time. So again, if you can look at that point where Mars stations direct, it can tell you a lot about how you will have to utilize your energies and where you will find your power, and perhaps also experience conflict and passion in the year ahead, in the 2 years ahead. So I've I think if we can see that one of the points of Mars retrograde leading up to when it stations direct is learning to discover power, discipline and strength in a new area of our lives, we can engage with this period of difficulty more creatively as something that we can see as helping us to build more power in more areas of our life, rather than something that's negative. And that's not always easy. If we're encouraged to discover our power in an area where we feel powerless, or an area where we feel more inclined to depend upon other people, that's going to be difficult, but the long-term effects are there to help make us a stronger person who is in more control of themselves, who can express their talents and firepower in more diverse areas of their life, rather than just honing all their strength into one area and then feeling weak and incomplete in the others. So I've given you a full kind of breakdown of one Mars retrograde cycle. I'm just going to give a few other examples of ways in which I felt empowered by previous Mars retrograde cycles. So when Mars stationed direct in my second house in 2020, second house is connected with money, but also with our values, our ability to create structure and discipline, to be careful in the management of our resources, and to make the most of our individual talents. And it was a period where I became much better at making money. I became much better at saving money, which previously I had not been. I used to be very erratic and just spend impulsively. I really learned the value of stability, of comfort, of instead of always chasing after novelty and new experiences, I learned to appreciate having material security, which was, again, something previously I had not cared a great deal about. When Mars stationed direct in my 12th house, I really learned to make the most of my unbounded imagination. That was a very difficult one because Mars is not comfortable in the 12th house at all. I think that's a subject for another video. But one of the positive things that did come out of that 2-year cycle was that it eventually motivated me to make an album that I felt was the complete synthesis of everything I could do musically at the time. I felt motivated to make this big prog rock album, which I am happy to say has now been released. I will put the link in the bio if you do want to release it, but had it not been for Mars in the 12th house, I probably would never have worked up the courage to make something that weird and unique and personal to myself. Probably the most dramatic Mars retrograde and station direct I ever experienced was when Mars was in the 7th house. Like I said, Mars is always going to be at its most extroverted and dramatic when going through the angular houses. And in the cycle prior to that, Mars had been going through my 6th. And so we can often get a feel of what we're moving away from and what we're moving to if we can look at where Mars was, house placement-wise, through our respective cycles. Very often Mars will move from one house to the next each year. So if you've had Mars in the 6th, it might be in the 7th or the 8th next year. If it's been in the 8th, it might be in the 9th or 10th next year. It can sometimes jump and skip quite a few because Mars has a very eccentric orbit, but still it generally moves in that clockwise motion through the houses in your chart. But if you can see the house that Mars stationed direct in previously and the one it's going to station direct in the next cycle, you can have a feeling of what you're having to move away from and what you're having to move towards. And during the period where Mars was in my 6th house, had been a period where I was very self-sufficient, where I was very focused on productivity and learning and trying to make more practical decisions about what to do with my life. It wasn't a period where I had relationships. It was a period where I was more alone and isolated, which is a quality of the 6th house. It's a place where we have to depend on our own resources rather than with other people. And yet when Mars was retrograding from my 7th in the build-up to that and then the station direct, I was 21 at the time. I ended up having my very first relationship. I ended up having sex for the first time. And so, yeah, I had my first long-term relationship, and I was really finding that after a long period of having been quite introverted and socially awkward and not very good at relating to other people, I was going through this period where I really had to learn the ways in which my life was independent with other people's, and learn to navigate conflicts and relationships with people which I had previously avoided. So again, Mars was forcing me to develop my energies and to have experience in this area that had previously been diminished or not well mapped out for me. So even though Mars usually does that in quite a dramatic way, we still learn a lot from the areas that he highlights for us. Anyway, I'm going to stop that there. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it instructive. I appreciate that if you are not necessarily a practicing astrologer, then all these specific terms about the station direct and retrograde and houses and aspects and so forth might be bewildering, but it really is worth looking into. If any of you want to share your experiences of what previous Mars retrograde periods have been like for you, I would love to know. I always learn the most about astrology from hearing other people's stories and comparing them with my own, so you're always doing me a favor when you share your own experiences, so please don't be too timid, just let me hear about it. Also, if you've felt any kind of aura symptoms or tremblings of what the Mars retrograde period forthcoming is going to be like, let me know as well. I would love to hear from you. It's always nice when sensitive people can share me their own reactions to the changes in the heavens. And yeah, if you want to come to me for more personal astrology to help navigate you through this difficult time, you can contact me at thestarsunraveled@outlook.com. I will include that email address in the bio below. Please like and subscribe to my channel, and if you want to help this channel grow so I can make more videos and perhaps monetize in the future, please do what you can to share my videos with other people, as that just means more viewership for me and more traction that I can get, and the more motivated I will feel to keep putting things into this. Anyway, bon voyage!